Hello, welcome. This is a special edition of Ask the Expert for Serverless September, and I'm super excited to have a bunch of really special guests today joining us from the Azure Container Apps team. I'm going to wait till they all come in, and then let's take a minute to introduce ourselves. Do you want to start, Daria?
Happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Daria Grigoriou. I'm a PM manager for Azure Container Apps and very happy to see you today.
Hi, I'm Mike Morton. Great to be here. I am also a PM on the Container Apps team.
Hey, I'm Anthony. Same thing, PM on the Container Apps team.
And I'm Kendall and also a PM on Container Apps. So happy to be here.
Wonderful. I think I'm super excited to get us started. But before we do that, just a little bit of housekeeping. We don't have a kind of like a slide on this, but code of conduct matters. Respect everyone on the chat. Be respectful about the questions you ask and also about the responses you give to the people on this. Make sure you go ahead and post your questions in the chat so that we'll have them ready for our experts to answer. And if I'm not mistaken, we may already have a question to start with. So shall we get started? Awesome. So I think the very first question was, how do we get multiple container apps to work together and communicate? Do you want to take this, Kendall?
Sure, yeah. So you know what, before I get there, Nydia, oh no, this is great. Okay, we'll start here. So typically when we think about container apps as a platform, the goal really is to enable microservices. It's a great workload type to run on top of container apps. And traditionally in microservice-based applications, there are multiple different components that all need to communicate and work together. And so in container apps, not only can you deploy a single app, but you can deploy multiple. And so we make it easy for those apps to communicate in that we manage all of the ingress and all of the networking infrastructure within the container apps environment. And so that means that you can actually immediately enable ingress on a container app, be it internal or external. And once you've done that, you can basically get the FQDN that's already generated for you and communicate from one app to another. So we make it really easy for you to wire up those services to work together. But in addition to that, we also provide a managed Dapr integration, or the distributed application runtime. It's an open source project that's really its focus is helping make microservices development easier. And so through Dapr, you can also do service communication using a different approach where you actually use built-in Dapr APIs and you can communicate to apps using basically a very unique application ID. So we provide a lot of really good support for communicating across services, be it with Envoy that's baked in or using Dapr and the Dapr integration as well.
Oh, that was excellent. Such a huge fan of Dapr. And I think we're going to probably have a lot of sessions on it at Ignite as well. So don't forget to check that out. I want to give anyone else a chance to weigh in before we move to the next question. Anyone else have things they want to talk about in this context?
No, I think Kendall did really good as far as I'm concerned.
All right. So
Nydia, the Dapr integration, one thing I didn't say is it does provide some other things. It baked in resiliency, for example. It also, some retries, right? So there are other things that you get, like MTLS. So that's one of the reasons why we do see some customers gravitate toward using that option. So just wanted to add that in.
Perfect. And don't forget to check out the links later in the chat and on the YouTube videos comment section. I think we'll take the next question. I think that was, what is the easiest way for you to deploy your container apps? And I think, Anthony, perhaps this one you could take on first.
Yeah, sure. So I think easiest really depends on your point of view. So there's quite a few ways that you could do it. So so for prototyping, it's probably good to just get an app working locally and just getting that up to the cloud. For that, we have a few ways. So we have integration with Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. That you can get your container apps deployed directly from those IDEs and editors. And we also have integration with the Azure CLI. So in the Azure CLI, you can run separate commands to create a container app environment, create a container app, and then deploy your app to it. Or there's actually an easier AZ container app up command that lets you kind of do all of that in one step. So if you don't have an environment created already, or if you don't have an app, it's going to do that for you first, and then it will go ahead and deploy the app. So all that in one command. So that's really good for like prototyping and stuff. And then as you kind of graduate to running production apps, we typically see our users and customers use things like GitHub Actions and Azure Devops and things like that to do a deployment. And within the CLI, we actually make it really easy for you to create a GitHub Actions workflow by running, I think, something like AZ Container App, GitHub Action something something. Or you can actually run AZ Container App up -- repo, and it's going to actually go and provision all the resources as well as the GitHub Action workflow, and then deploy your app with that one command. So lots of options. I probably missed a couple, but yeah, there you go.
That sounds good. And shameless plug, I think you had a really nice article on that on our tech community blog. So I hope people check that out. There was, I think, a bunch of samples people can also use to get started with exploring some of these tools. And that's listed in that link as well. Should we go on to the next question? Okay, great. So I think the next question I saw was, how can I see the logs my container emits? And perhaps, Mike, you want to take this on?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, your logs, anything that goes to your standard out or standard air streams, you can see those logs in a couple different ways for container apps. One of the easiest ways is just go look at literally the streaming logs. That'll give you the live logs that are being emitted from your container. If you want to look at a more historical view of your logs, you can use log analytics. So when you create a container app environment, a log analytics workspace is created for you. And then you can use that to look at and run queries against that to look at the logs kind of in the historical past. And one other thing, it's not logs, but there's another really handy thing where you can connect to the console. So go to the portal, or you can use the CLI, both for the logs that I talked about, streaming logs, but you can also connect to the console of any of your containers. And there you can look at not just logs, but actually maybe some configurations if you're having a problem. So that's another really handy technique when you're diagnosing one of your container apps.
That's cool. And in the meantime, I'm seeing some more questions come, but I want to give everyone a chance to kind of respond. And is there anything else you want to add to that particular question before we move to the next one? Okay, cool. The next one seems to be...
Actually, I should have added one more thing. I am so sorry. It's not just your console logs coming out of your containers, but the Azure Container, let's say runtime or the service itself, also emits logs to a system log file. So another great place to look for things when things aren't maybe going right, or just to view what's going on. Thanks.
Oh, wonderful. We're beginning to get a lot more questions on the chat. So I think we'll take one from there now. The first one says, is there a plan to add support for Windows-based containers? And I'm wondering, Daria, do you want to grab this one?
Happy to. Right now, we don't have a plan to add Windows-based containers. However, we do have a GitHub repo where you can tell us about why you need Windows-based containers. We just really love to learn how you might be using that capability. But right now, we don't have a plan.
And I'll just make a note of the fact that we'll get the link and put it into our chat and on the our recording later, so you can find that. Anyone else want to weigh in on that before we take the next question from the audience? Awesome. So I think the next one basically I don't know if they're related, but it says, is there a way to permanently delete inactive revisions? Does anyone want to weigh in?
I think I can probably try to take that one. So there currently is not a way to delete inactive revisions, but they're not actually taking up any space or costing you anything. But if you're like a neat freak like me, you probably want to, you might want to kind of clean them up. So we are looking at different options that we might that we might support in the future to allow that, and also perhaps even ways to auto purge those things. But for now, no, I don't think you can do that.
Cool, thank you. And feel free, by the way, for those of you watching, feel free to go and add a question either on the YouTube stream or on Twitch or wherever you're watching, and we'd love to hear more from you on what are the issues that are important to you. So we'll take on the next question, which is actually one of my favorite ones, which asks, how can we scale container apps? And I'm going to let Daria address this, because this is actually one of the issues that I think a lot of folks in this space care about.
I think there are a couple of different aspects that we hear people care about. The first one is what kind of scale triggers can you support? And the other one is, can I scale to 0? And so we can start with the first aspect. So we support different scale triggers based on HTTP traffic. So basically the number of concurrent HTTP requests, event-driven, and that is supported through the KeyVault project. So you can go to the KeyVault project, KeyVault.sh, and look at the different opportunities that we have in terms of the types of scalars that we support. And also based on resource usage, so CPU and memory. And yes, you can scale to 0. And it's great to confirm that when you do scale to 0, then you're not billed for that time, so you pay for what you use. And that's one of the core tenets and value props of serverless compute.
Thank you. And I know Kata is like a big talker for it. Does anyone have anything they want to add on the scaling side, auto scaling for container apps? Okay, I will take one more question from the audience. I think there are a couple actually. So let's see, which one shall we take? Let's take the one which says, can container apps handle 8 or more CPU? And can you explain container resource allocation? Who wants to grab this one?
I can take a try at that. So can it, for a single container app, currently we do not support 8 CPUs. You can, of course, deploy multiple container apps. I think our current limits are 2 CPUs and 4 gigabytes of memory. That's something we're always looking to adjust and likely increase in the future. But today, that is the limits. What was the second part of that question, Nitya?
I think it may still be on the screen. It says, can you explain container resource allocation?
Oh, wow. Not sure I can do that. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure I can do that in detail. I don't know if Kendall or someone else wants to try to take that one. That's a tough one. But obviously, when you deploy a container app, you request how much memory and CPU you want. And then we'll tell the infrastructure underneath the covers to do exactly that. So beyond that, I don't want to get into too many details because I'll probably say it wrong.
Yeah, I would say too, just adding on that, we do have a doc that kind of explains all of the different resource allocation bits, what the different like parameters are that you can pass in. So I would say maybe we can drop a link to that doc specifically. And if there's anything unclear from that documentation, I think that's an opportunity for us to go back and enhance. So I see there's another question that I can just go ahead and roll into if we want, Nydia.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to read out the question first before you jump in?
Yeah, so I think it's how can we deploy Azure Container Apps spread across multiple repositories with Bicep? So I think this is like a really valid question, right? It's interesting with container apps, especially if you're coming from, maybe the Kubernetes world where you have a bunch of microservices defined in maybe YAML or using GitOps. So it's a little different whenever you move to a world like container apps where you can actually deploy your applications using Bicep and ARM. And so what I think there's a unique opportunity for you to do if you have your applications in different repositories is that Bicep has some really good capabilities where you can reference existing resources. So for example, if you had multiple apps spread across maybe 5 repositories, you can actually reference existing resources, i.e. your existing container apps environment, while you do the deployment of those independent resources. So I think rather than having one Bicep manifest in a single repository that's pointing to all of those apps, you could use the exact same type of approach, but instead you would just reference an existing environment and only have the container apps manifest for that given container app. Does that make sense? I hope it does. I would love an additional follow-up to that question if that's not clear, but I really think it's more how can we use Bicep to reference existing resources versus necessarily like a container apps specific question. I don't know. Does anyone else want to chime in on that one? But that's what I've done in the past when I had apps in multiple repositories. And maybe we can put together an example of that. I think that's a good opportunity. Cool.
I think you just signed up for that. I was actually going to point that out because the second part of the thing says all the samples they've seen so far have not kind of had that multi-repo thing. So this could be a great opportunity to showcase one. And also just to reinforce what Kendall said, if you ask the question and you actually want to clarify it further, feel free to put that in the chat. Even if we don't get to it today, we will be able to post all those questions along with the video recording later. Let's move on to the next one. And I think this one is the one which says, what about batch? I want my container to stop after my batch ends. Currently, it restarts several times and then scales down to 0. The question is it possible? And Kendall, I think you should take this one.
Sure, yeah. So we don't currently support a jobs model by default or natively within container apps. So I think the objective or the really underlying question there is support for jobs coming in a productive way for me? And the answer is we are working on jobs. That is an objective to bring the concept of jobs into the platform, which should enable some of these scenarios, whether it's batch jobs or I want to run, cron jobs, things like that. Our objective is to hopefully get the requirements from all of you to understand how we can bring that best into the platform. So would love, once again, for you to go to our GitHub repo and give additional information regarding your requirements for the platform, because what we're building is basically based on, what the needs are of this community. So appreciate the ask, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some good feature-rich capability there in the future.
I'll just give a second for if anyone else wants to add to that before we move on. Cool. Questions are flying in now, so this is great. I'm going to jump to the question from the audience, which says, will container apps solve the problem of slow initial run of a new scaled replica? In Azure Functions, this was an issue for functions in consumption plans. Daria, do you want to perhaps take this one?
Yeah, happy to. So I think it's important to note that unlike Azure Functions, in container apps, we can really run any container image. We don't enforce a programming model. We don't enforce a base image. And so we have less insight into what exactly is running. So a lot of the performance, the cold start performance, depends on the size of your image, the characteristics of your image. And so we expect that when you do want to optimize that performance, that maybe you'll use some of the opportunities that we have in the platform, for example, to define the minimum and the maximum number of replicas in terms of scaling and making sure that you tune the platform to account for the image characteristics and the performance characteristics of your application, and really treat this as something that you have insight into and can educate the platform about.
That sounds great. And actually, did anyone else want to weigh in on this quickly before we move to the next one?
Yeah, I would just add one of the cool things that I think was learned from Azure Functions is that a lot of people can't incur a cold start whenever a function is, spinning up essentially. So we did create the concept of idle container apps, which is essentially container apps that never scale all the way to 0, but are still billed at a lower rate. So the nice thing is, unlike Azure Functions, where you might pay a premium cost in order to keep that instance warm, you're able to still get a lower cost model while keeping a container app idle. So what that means is when a new revision is to spin up, it should alleviate some of those cold starts that you incur. So just want to add that in, but I agree with Daria. I think holistically, you need to consider, the different needs of your application as well. And then there was another question around scale that I think we could probably just knock out. If you know the difference between T1 and T2, you'll have extra traffic. Can you pre-configure scaling? I don't know what the context of T1 and T2 is. I don't know if we're saying that's a revision, perhaps. That would be my assumption here. What I will say is there's not necessarily like a pre-configuration of scaling. However, you can have different scale rules per revision. So that is something that if you recognize, hey, I'm going to have more traffic on this particular revision, you could have a separate scale rule that makes sure that it scales at a different, maybe based on a different input, or based on it needs additional scaling, like it has a higher number of maximum replicas, that kind of thing. So I'm not sure, Anthony or Mike, if you think of T1 or T2 as something different than that.
I was assuming they were a service, Anthony.
No, I think T1 and T2 is if there's a certain span of time, like a sale on like a one-day sale, and they want to scale up a site. Can they pre-configure scaling? And I think that ties into the previous answer about setting a minimum number of replicas, because when your app is running at a minimum number of replicas, like Kendall was saying earlier, you do qualify for idle billing. So if those replicas running are not receiving an HTTP requests, or its CPU is not above a certain percentage, you actually pay a much lower cost. And then as soon as that request comes in or needs to process something, then it's instantly ready for you. And then only at that point are you charged the regular active rate for that replica.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That min number of replicas can be really handy, and you can do that, like Anthony said, dynamically with a timed job that's going to run a CLI command to increase and decrease that as you need to.
That's cool. So I'm actually going to take us to the next question because I know we just have a few minutes left. I think maybe this might be for you, Mike. The question is, does Container Apps support health probes?
Absolutely. We support the typical health probes that you would expect. We support the startup probe, which if you have, typically that's for a longer startup. Maybe you need to load some data or something. We also support the liveness probe. So when your container is ready to accept requests, the liveness probe, the readiness probe, you can use that. And then the liveness probe is a probe that can kind of do a heartbeat type thing to make sure your application is alive and healthy. So we support all of those types of probes. Those can be over both HTTP and TCP, so you can have your choice of which protocol you want to use for those probes also.
Yeah, and I'm fairly sure there's documentation on this, so we should definitely put that in the links here as well. Sorry,
Absolutely.
Did someone want to follow up on this before we take the next one? Okay, cool. So there is a question from the audience, which is, are there plans to add support for KeyVault secret references similar to app service?
I think I can take that one. So we are working on that right now. So I think currently the way that we're designing it would look a lot like app services, where you can, instead of providing container apps a value for the secret, you can actually provide a reference to a secret that's living in KeyVault, and you can use a managed identity that's been configured in your app to grab that secret. So that you have that opportunity to kind of store it in a place that you want to, versus having to store it in container apps.
That seemed pretty straightforward. Anyone else want to weigh in before we take another question? Cool. The next question from the audience is there support for ARM CPU architecture scheduled? Daria, do you want to take this?
Yes, not at this time, but as with any item that is not currently on our roadmap, please feel free to visit our repo, tell us what you need and why you need it. We'd love to learn from you and understand how we can best support you.
Cool. So I think we're still waiting. So take a minute and ask us more questions. For those of you who already asked questions, if you want to clarify specific use cases or have additional questions to layer on top of that, feel free to add them in the chat. But for now, I'm going to kind of open it up for just a couple of minutes while we wait for more questions to say, is there anything that we should be talking about right now for Azure Container Apps for someone who's just coming here for the first time and learning how to use it?
Yeah, I had a question for Anthony. Actually, I'm surprised no one's asked too much about revisions. So, Anthony, can you give a quick overview of what revisions are and how they can help a developer using container apps?
Yeah, so one unique kind of concept within container apps is the concept of revisions. So by default, an app will run in single revision mode. So as soon as you kind of deploy like an update to your app, it'll automatically deactivate the previous revision and activate the new one that you deployed. But you can actually enable multiple revision mode. So if you want to deploy a new revision at 0% traffic and then kind of test that on its own little URL first before you kind of swap traffic to it, you can do that. Or if you want to split traffic between multiple revisions, you can do that as well.
Thanks.
Thanks for that surprise question there, Mike.
You bet. It's actually something that I was asked on. It's actually something I was asked on Twitter the other day. And I talked to the person offline, so I just thought that'd be a good one to share.
While we wait for other questions, I think we have time for one more. Does anyone here want to bring up anything? Otherwise, I'd love to hear about what you see as some domains and use cases that people are using this for today. Unless you've got a different question you want to address.
I think there's a couple things that are pretty handy. We do support custom domains, and so if you want to deploy a website or an API or whatever, but you'd like to use your own custom domain and certificate, you can definitely do that with Azure Container Apps. And Anthony, either you or Kendall mentioned that we have the system identity or user identity, but each service or each container app can have its own managed identity, which is great for talking to other Azure services, storage, databases, things like that.
Yeah, and I will add there too, there's a couple questions that have come in. So I'll add one thing and then maybe we can flip over to these last couple of questions. But yeah, I think when it comes to managed identity, there's a lot of exciting use cases there. And one of the things that we've recently talked about a little bit in our Serverless September blogs, which I recommend, is going and checking out how you can really connect to external sources from container apps via secrets, via managed identity, user assigned or system assigned. So definitely recommend going and checking out the Serverless September blogs on that, because I think it'll give you some good information. There was a question from Phil that said, will there be support in the future to use managed identity to pull ACR images? I don't know if Anthony, you want to give a quick answer to that one?
Yeah, so that was added a couple months ago. So you can do that now. And yeah, you can do that in the portal when you update your container app, as well as in the CLI when you create or update a container app.
I know we have just a couple of minutes and there are 2 questions, so let's get to them really quickly. Will there be support in the future? I think that's the one you just answered. The next one was, will container apps be added as an environment resource type in Azure Devops?
So I'm not aware of that being on our radar at all, but we can definitely, if you can actually create an issue on our GitHub repo, that'd be great. So currently in Azure DevOps, I think you can choose between VMs and like Kubernetes clusters. And I think the question is, can container apps be part of that as well? So yeah, please create a GitHub issue.
That was easy. And then we have one more question, which maybe this will be for Kendall. This says, why is there a specific Dapr component structure for ACA and not utilizing the same Dapr component structure?
Yeah, so like if the question specifically around why our Dapr component schema is simplified, I think it's a valid question, right? I think a decision was made in order to make the experience easier. And I think that comes with potential opportunities to optimize now that we've seen how customers use Dapr in the platform. I know it's not necessarily ideal for people who are using Dapr in open source. So we have taken that feedback into account, and hopefully we'll see a little bit of movement that might ease that disparity. But it's a valid question. And then there was a question also, last one maybe, on Service Connector. I don't know if anyone wants to take that one, but I think just when we talk about secrets, managed identity, all of that kind of stuff, Service Connector just makes it super, super easy for you to access external services, be it behind networking infrastructure, using a private endpoint. They really handle all of that for you. And so I think it just eases that connectivity, right? If I don't want to have to worry about going and storing secrets or figuring out how to wire up a secure connection to Cosmos DB, Service Connector essentially handles that for you. So there's going to be a lot of, I think, exciting progress in that direction as well on the platform moving forward.
Oh my gosh, this has been super fast. So I think we don't have a lot of time right now to take more questions, but please do keep them and we will be answering them in blog post after this. In the meantime, I just want to thank all our guests, and I'm going to leave you with this link. So if you're interested in any of the content you've seen today, don't forget to check out Serverless September. That's https://aka.ms serverless-september to learn about all the different initiatives that we've got going on this month, from Ask the Expert to Serverless Hacks, 30 days of serverless blogs, community where you can go and submit your own articles and tags, and also the Zero to Hero series where you will find articles from our experts today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate all the questions. We hope you'll be able to find the answers you need and look forward to the next one. Thank you.